career trajectory, etc., we'll also open the floor for anyone who'd like to ask those. Before we launch into an introduction, though, just a disclaimer, we will be recording this session for anyone who isn't able to make it today. So if anyone has issues with that, please feel free to just let us know. We want everyone to be comfortable, and I'll wait a little bit for someone to let me know if there are issues. And if not, then we're just going to be really excited to introduce Sarah Kunst. She is the managing director of Clio Capital and a contributing editor at Marie Claire magazine at the moment. And in the past, she's served as a senior advisor at Bumble, where she focused on their corporate VC arm, Bumble Fund, and also on the board of the Michigan State University Foundation Endowment. Ms. Kunst has also been named a future innovator by Vanity Fair, Forbes magazine 30 Under 30, and a top 25 innovator in tech by Cool Hunting. And moreover, she's also been recognized for her work in Business Insider as a 30 Under 30 woman in tech, and top African American in tech, and PitchBook top Black VC to watch, as well as honored as a top woman in VC by the Wall Street Journal. So clearly, Ms. Kunst, we're so excited to have you. If there's anything I missed that you'd like to add, I'm happy to hand things over to you.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, guys. Excited to be here and do this again. I had so much fun last year doing it as well. So, would love to just sort of jump in, and you did a great job introducing me. And so would love to just jump in and start the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So we at HUCP have prepped a couple questions, so I'll launch into those. If anyone else has any follow-up questions they'd like to ask, any questions of their own, feel free to raise your virtual hand or just jump in at an opportune time. But with that said, I think we'll start with just Sarah. Do you think you'd be able to tell us a little bit more in depth about yourself and your career path, and perhaps what those experiences have meant to you thus far as well?
Yeah. So, I'm from Michigan. I went to Michigan State University. And so, during college, had to work, and didn't want, a job where I was working, nights or weekends, because I wanted to be able to go out and have fun. And so, I started getting campus rep jobs. And, that really is a huge part of the reason why I'm in the industry I'm in now. I worked for several different campus rep roles, but, eventually worked with Apple as a campus rep. And so, this was Michigan State University is in the middle of nowhere in Michigan. And so, we don't have an Apple store close by. The closest one is probably like an hour and a half away. And so, it was actually probably more like 2 hours. So, we were sort of the face of Apple on campus. This is, pre iPhone. So it was just the computers, and, people had iPods as well, but it was just the computers. And it was really, kind of one of those things where the really basic questions about Apple, were like, oh, is it going to work with like Microsoft Word and things like that? And so, we were evangelists on campus for the computers, and for Apple. But the other thing that did is it got me sort of, I started to get to know people in the tech world. And so, we worked for Apple corporate. And so, my bosses at the Apple headquarters, I would see, one of them went to Facebook really early and worked there. And so I started paying attention, more to Facebook as just more than just a user, because all of a sudden I had a friend who like left Apple, the coolest tech company in the world at the time, to go work, at this new thing, Facebook. And so it was, a huge part of what led me into tech was just, that early job. And you guys are in a much different position. You're all at a very, very, very fancy school. Michigan State, is a great school, but it is not Harvard. And so people aren't coming, on campus necessarily to recruit us into really fancy, companies like Apple. And so it was a sort of more, somewhat more circuitous way in. But, I think that the lesson there is that, I think sometimes, especially at schools like yours, there's so much pressure to be, to be interning at the fanciest place. And, how are you going to get these jobs if you're not doing that? And the reality is that, you can actually find your way into great careers and great jobs from like, you know, the jobs that you do for money, not just sort of the you know, unpaid internships or the kind of prestige recruiting stuff that we think about as the path into tech. So, you know, that's how I was aware of the tech world. After school, I went to a totally different part of the world. I worked at Chanel in marketing right out of school. And so was at their US headquarters, moved to New York, and then, you know, decided I really cared about tech and I wanted to go be, oh my God, hold on one second, guys. I'm in a hotel and I have to grab this phone call. Sorry about that. I'm in Miami for Art Basel and my hotel is calling me. But so yeah, so you know, I was after school, I was working at Chanel and then decided to go, you know, into tech full time. And so ended up working for two very famous alumni of your school, the Winklevoss twins at a startup they had prior to, you know, their time in cryptocurrency now, at Gemini, where we are now investors in Gemini, which is awesome. But you know, was working for them at a media startup they had in New York, and that was really, you know, where I got sort of super in depth on tech. So you know, the New York startup scene at the time was very much focused on media, and I was able to get in there and just start getting to know people. And you know, I was just at dinner last night with one of my investors now, who runs one of the biggest venture funds in New York. And you know, I met him. I moved to New York in 2008 after school, and I, you know, met a lot of these people in 2009, 2010, and you know, met them maybe in passing at an event or invited them to something. And now, you know, years and years and years later, I'm still working with them closely, and a lot of them I've invested in them or they've, you know, become an investor in me. And I think it just sort of goes to show that a lot of the relationships that you start building early, if you nurture them, you know, there's really a great opportunity to turn those into kind of lifelong, you know, relationships with great outcomes. So you know, was working for the twins and at a startup, and then went to a Y Combinator backed startup, and then after that, on the West Coast, always in kind of biz dev roles. So, you know, definitely didn't have to, you know, go be an engineer in order to work in tech. And then, you know, after that, I got recruited into venture capital. And so, you know, there's sort of two ways to get recruited into venture capital. You can kind of end up in venture capital because you see a job opening and you apply and you do a bunch of interviews. And, you know, that is something that tends to be a path that a lot of your peers at school or a lot of your fellow alum will probably take, just because it is something where, you know, when a big venture fund is going out and recruiting for junior people, they're often coming, you know, on a campus like yours to recruit. And so you will see that sometimes. The rest of, you know, the other way to get into venture is usually kind of the exact opposite, which is super random. And that's how I ended up in venture. You know, I got a job at a fund that wasn't even hiring. So it wasn't like, you know, you could apply for the job and do interviews. It was, I was talking to an investor about the startup that I was at as it was sort of winding down and running out of money. And I was talking, you know, to her about, hey, what do I do? What's going to happen to this startup? And, you know, in through those conversations, you know, she was like, well, it seems like your, you know, startup is failing. But, you know, she would ask me questions and say, you know, have you ever heard about, you know, this kind of company, or have you seen this before? And she would just ask me these questions. And I would, you know, instead of just kind of sending her back quick answers, I would spend a bunch of time, you know, really being thoughtful and sending her these like long notes back that in retrospect were, you know, they were really, you know, it was almost like diligence that I was doing that I didn't know I was doing for her. And I was just trying to be thoughtful and helpful to her because she'd spent a bunch of time, with me being helpful. And so it was one of those things where I think a great lesson there is that it makes a lot of sense to really kind of think of every touch point as an opportunity to build a relationship and learn. So it would have been easy for her to say, for her to come to me and say, hey, have you ever heard of this kind of company? And for me to say, nope, I haven't, sorry. Right. And instead, even if I hadn't, I would go do research. I would spend, an hour instead of, watching TV or going out for drinks with friends, going through and figuring things out to help her. And it was just sort of a way to help her, but it turned out to be incredibly helpful to me because that's how I got the job. And so, I often get inbounds from founders or students who are looking, hey, can I pick your brain? Can I ask you for advice? And I don't have a lot of time, so oftentimes I can't say yes. But when people come to me and say, hey, Sarah, you mentioned that you're looking for an intern, here's a great candidate, or you mentioned that you were trying to find a company that does XYZ, or you're interested in this thing, then I often, will make time to help that person or to help those people because, they're making time to help me. And I really appreciate that. So, that is sort of why that is often, I think, a great way to get what you're looking for. I always tell people that the best way to get what you want is to help everybody else get what they want usually. And so, that's how I ended up in venture capital as an analyst at More Davidow Ventures, which was a $1.7 billion Sand Hill Road fund. And then after that, I went and started a company and was a founder. And that was a really interesting experience. I ran a company for 3 years, raised money from institutional investors, angel investors, did an accelerator. And then after that, really wanted to get back to kind of my first love, which was investing. So decided to become an investor and started Clio Capital. And in between all of that, was on a board at Michigan State University where, we helped do limited partner investing, which meant we were investing into venture funds. You guys obviously have one of the biggest endowments in the world. And so if you're not already familiar with that, piece of the industry, you certainly should be, because you have a lot, a huge endowment at your school that's investing on your behalf. And then, was also at Bumble, the dating app that went public earlier this year, helped them launch their corporate VC arm. And that focused on investing in primarily women of color led startups. So, had a lot of experience. I didn't wake up one day and say, hey, maybe I want to be a VC. I had already had a lot of different experiences in investing. And then it just got to a point where, for me at least, it made a lot of sense to go and be an investor full time. And so I started Clio, and started Clio in 2018. And then now with Fund One, and now we're busy with Fund Two. So it's been a crazy journey, I guess, of the last I think it took you from 2005 to now. And so if you want to know how you can start a venture fund, in your early 30s, the answer is, you just have to spend a decade before that learning and working in tech. And then it's not easy, but it's certainly not impossible.
That's amazing, Sarah. And I don't know if crazy is the best way to put it, perhaps extraordinary, but thank you so much for sharing that. I actually did want to ask a follow-up question here, and if anyone else has any, feel free to jump in with those as well. Sarah, you described tech as your first love, and you describe your love for investing as well. And so I'm just curious, after all those twists and turns that your career has taken, why did you end up sticking with venture and tech? And did you ever consider perhaps not venturing into other fields of finance and investing?
For me, I've never been super interested in other fields of finance. I think that there are some people, and I certainly have a lot of friends and colleagues who have worked in finance broadly and then decide to be in venture as a kind of investing. For me, it was sort of the reverse. I'd always worked in tech, and I decided to become, a tech investor versus, saying, hey, I worked at Goldman and then I worked at this private equity shop or hedge fund, and then, okay, maybe I'll try venture. And so certainly I think you can do either of them, but in general, you don't find a ton of tech world people who wake up one day and decide they want to be like a hedge fund executive, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course, and that makes a lot of sense as well. Also, just wanted to follow up on that, if it's okay. I know you've worked at a plethora of different companies, and those have ranged from Apple to Chanel to Red Bull, to various different venture funds, to being a startup founder. And so I'm just curious, how has working on the business and the tech side of things informed your current investing role? And do you see something about the relationship between the two that's made you good at investing in ways that perhaps other people in your field aren't?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to be a great investor. And a lot of it comes down to your natural skill sets, right? So for me, a lot of the ways that I can be the best investor and most helpful investor to my founders is by spending a lot of time, helping founders with early stage company building and sort of operating questions, because I've been an operator, right? Whereas if I came from the finance side, and if I was coming out of a hedge fund before I got into venture, the best way to be helpful to my founders would probably not be giving necessarily startup building advice, but it would be saying, hey, here are things that you might not be thinking of on the finance side of things. Like I know that well. And so, certainly never want people to feel like the only way to be successful, in a given industry is by doing what somebody else does. Generally, the best way to be successful in anything in life is to, be really true to yourself and do what makes sense for you. And so, I think for me, certainly being an operator and founder, and specifically having a lot of deep experience on the kind of CMO suite side, I've been able to be incredibly helpful to companies in those things. But that's because I have that skill set, and if I had a different skill set, then the things that I would be helpful to companies in would be different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And to bounce off of what you said about giving perhaps founders some building advice, operating advice, etc., because that is your area of expertise. I'm also a little bit curious, and there are definitely founders in our audience today. Are there any things that founders should know before they pitch to you? Because I know from previous interviews, you've said things like understanding your market and the necessity of your company being coachable, etc. But are there other factors beyond those?
I think that the one of the best kind of qualities in a founder is somebody who has a lot of passion and expertise for what they're building. And so what I mean by that, and I see this sometimes, with really smart people like you guys, where you'll see people who kind of start a company and they're not necessarily, that excited, or they're not that, interested. They just sort of come up with an idea because they have to for a class or for a pitch contest. And then, they win, and then they're kind of off to the races building something that they're not necessarily that passionate about. And that is something that I think is kind of a bummer, right? I don't think that makes the most sense. I think what makes the most sense is when you can say, what's something that you are really, really excited about and that you know a lot about. And you guys, when you start a company earlier on, you don't necessarily know a ton about anything, in the sense of like, it is, you can't have decades of experience in doing anything if you're only 20, right? Because I guess you've been a human your whole life, but you haven't done very many other things your whole life, and so that's fine. And certainly I think students can be great entrepreneurs, although I think that there's often far too much pressure to start a company young now versus wait. But I think that if it's something that you've always had a passion in, or you've always been really excited by, and you've always been reading about and researching or majoring in, to me that usually is a lot more compelling than feeling like, hey, you like woke up yesterday and decided that you wanted to be a founder, and then somebody told you, that XYZ is a multi-trillion-dollar market, and so now you're building a company in that market.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for that answer, Sarah. And on that note about founders, I will now open it up to anyone in the audience who has any further questions. If you do, feel free to just unmute yourself and give them. So again, if anyone has any questions, go ahead. All right, if there aren't any questions, I can keep going with mine. And if anyone does end up having any follow-up questions, feel free to cut in whenever you'd like. But I think to move on a little bit from what founders should know, and to give our audience today a little bit more insight into what happens in the later stage deliberation room, Sarah, I also did want to ask, what does the deliberation room kind of look like when those at Clio Capital are deciding whether or not to invest in a company or invest in a founder?
Yeah. So, I think it depends from investor to investor. And so, certainly you shouldn't think that what I'm saying is sort of the only thing, and that all investors kind of think the same way. But for me, like I said, we really, really like seeing founder product fit is what we call it. So founders who, have a reason to be building what they're building, who are really excited to be building what they're building. And, that tends to be a big thing for us. We also really like coachable people. You guys are all incredibly smart. And that's great. But the reality is, you'll be wrong about things sometimes, especially company building. Even if you have a 4.0 and perfect attendance and everything, you'll eventually, be wrong. And if you're not very good at like asking for help, or asking for hey, I thought I knew this thing, I actually don't, what do I do? It's going to be almost impossible to run a company. And so looking for people who understand that, and who are kind of willing to say, hey, I don't know what this is, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not sure. Those are really, really, really good qualities to have. And they tend to just make founders much stronger. And so it might feel a little bit funny to say, hey, I'm looking for somebody who's good at saying, oh my gosh, I totally messed up, I'm really wrong about this, or other things. But, we actually do think that is one of the most important things you can do as a founder. And then also, looking for people who are solving really big problems. So the bigger kind of the market that you're building in, all of that, the more likely it is that you're going to be able, to build a multi-billion-dollar company. And you certainly don't always have to build a multi-billion-dollar company in life, but if you're raising venture funding, the goal of venture funding, is a venture size outcome, which does have to be a pretty big exit. And so, it often is, if you're building a company in a smaller space, right? So if you're building a company in a $2 billion industry, to build $1 billion company means that you have to like get half of all of the kind of available business in that category. That's really, really, really hard, right? If you're building a company in a $1 trillion industry, getting to become $1 billion company gets orders of magnitude easier because it is such a big market that you could mess up things all the time and still kind of have this big company.
Yeah, makes total sense, Sarah, and thank you so much for that. Before I ask my own personal follow-up question, we do have a question from Mai in the chat, and you can access that, but I'll also read it out just in case.
Yeah, or
Mai just
might come off mute if she wants, and if not, then yeah, feel free to read it out.
Yeah, I think Mai is in the library, but I can read it out for anyone who can't access the chat right now. And Sarah, feel free to answer right after. So Mai is just asking, what is the biggest barrier you faced when establishing your own fund? And what has been your strategy during the COVID pandemic, which started just 1 year after Clio's founding?
Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so you know, in terms of starting the fund, I started it in 2018, and venture funds, you usually think of a venture fund start date as sort of like a graduation date from school, right? So I'd started the fund actually a while before that. And you know, vintage years in funds means like kind of when you're done fundraising and you actually start deploying the capital. It usually takes people on average 18 months to raise a fund before they start investing out of it. So, you know, I had started raising the fund in 27 or late 2017, early 2018. So, you know, I by the time COVID hit, I'd been running the fund and investing out of the fund for almost 2 years. And so didn't start the fund during COVID, but you know, it was certainly a huge you know, change to everything. We had always been willing to look at founders and invest remotely. And so some companies, you know, don't do that, and they say, hey, you have to come in, you know, and some VCs say I have to meet with the founders, you know, I have to do it in person. And that wasn't the case for us ever. So it was pretty easy, you know, to make that part of the shift. But raising money, you know, certainly was really hard because we were all of a sudden saying, hey, you know, we have to figure out you know, how to get people to give us money who've maybe never met us in person before. And that's kind of a crazy thing, right? We were comfortable with it, but most people who invest into venture funds, you know, not only do they want to get to know you in person, but, you know, they want to come see your offices. They want to spend all this time with you. And all of a sudden, you know, in early COVID, that was completely impossible. And so what do, you know, when it's impossible to spend time in person? And so that was really hard for the first few months of COVID. And you know, then I think people have sort of gotten used to it and figured it out, and it's fine. But it was certainly for a very long time at the beginning of COVID, really, you know, nobody really knew what to do, because a lot of investors actually had a requirement that they meet you in person before they invest, but they couldn't. And we didn't know how long they would, you know, not be able to meet in person, but they did still have this requirement. So that was a really, really, really interesting piece of all of this, that thankfully we're on the other side of now, but that was probably the most challenging thing in the early days, more on the fundraising side. And the investing side, you know, we have never made founders come meet us in person necessarily. We certainly like it, but it was never a requirement. And so we were in a really good spot to just say, well, I guess they definitely can't meet us in person now, and let's just, you know, keep finding great deals and keep investing in great founders.
Yeah, it sounds amazing, Sarah. And clearly Clio has continued investing in great founders, etc. And to bounce off of that, I think I saw Tiffany's hand after. So Tiffany, go for it.
Yeah, hi team for organizing, and thanks Sarah for coming here. So I have two questions, but I'll start with the first one. And it's about team, kind of like you were saying, in terms of what you look for in a team. And so to give a little bit of background, I'm not from Harvard. I went to school down the street, so I'm from MIT. Graduated a couple years ago, and now I'm a med student at Penn. going to be graduating from Penn and then working on a women's health startup full time. And I was talking with like different kind of investors or like former founders, and one thing that I heard from a couple people was you have a really strong deck. You know, you and your co-founder, both engineers, like doctors, like really legit, but you don't have a business person on the founding team, and we'd really like to see a business person. And that's something that I've really, I guess I was like, I guess those were points that kind of took me by surprise, and I'm not sure what to do with that. So I guess I wanted to hear your perspective on like whether it's crucial to have someone from like a business background to be on the founding team, or if it could be someone who's a very early hire.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be either. The reality is, right, it's kind of like dating, and you can go on a date with somebody and then be like, oh, you know, I didn't like that they were tall or short or bald or whatever, had really long hair. The reality is, if it was the right person, then that'd be okay. And if it's not the right person, then there's always a reason, right? And so, you know, certainly the one thing, you know, you're always going to have to do in startups is grow your team and build your team. And so, you know, it's certainly, you will eventually need more people, but, you know, if it's the right investor and they're excited about what you're doing, like, they're going to invest. And if it's not, they're not. And so, you know, it sounds like, you know, the reality is, if any of those investors were truly like just completely obsessed with what you're doing, they would say, hey, I love what you're doing. I want to invest. And as part of the investment, you know, I am going to, you know, insist that the next key hire, you know, be a business person. I'm going to go help you find one. Right. And so, you know, if you have great people around the table who, you know, could be you know, great investors in that side, then you should definitely think about that. Or I mean, great founders on the business side, you should definitely be open to adding more founders. But, you know, if you don't have somebody and you're making progress on building the company, I certainly don't think it's a requirement. And it sounds more like it's just you're talking to investors who are looking for a polite reason or way to tell you that it's not something they're super excited about right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess like then my follow-up question to that is like, what are some elements of good investor team fit that you would recommend people look for on both sides of the table?
Yeah, the reality, right, is like, you know, if you need money, then you need to go find somebody to give you money and take the money, right? And so, you know, if you were coming to me saying, hey, I have, you know, 2 term sheets and don't know either of the investors super well, how do I think about it? Or, you know, great, then, you know, happy to have that conversation. It sounds like your problem is a bit on a different side of things, which is you need to find people who want to give you money, period. And so, you know, when that's the case, I think that you know, good relationships are good relationships, right? So why do you get along with your roommates or your friends or whoever? It's somewhat specific to you, but it's also largely, you know, kind of, are you polite? Are you nice? Are you honest? Are you whatever, you know, reliable, whatever it is. So all those things certainly apply. But the reality is that for most people raising capital for the first time, it is a much bigger question of where can you find capital, period. And, you know, if somebody's asking you, if somebody's an amazing seeming investor, but they're asking you for like some really, really, really crazy terms that are going to hurt your business, then you shouldn't take it, even if you get along with them super well. If somebody seems like kind of a so-so investor, you're not like so excited about them individually, but you need money and they're willing to give you money, then, you know, you should maybe take it, even, you know, if the terms are good, clean terms, and you should maybe take it, even if you're not like so freakishly excited about it. So, you know, I guess I would caution against over optimizing when you don't, you know, have an investor yet. And I would much more suggest, you know, getting an investor who wants to give you money so that you can build your company, and worrying a little bit less about sort of, the right investor is the investor who gives you money so that your company continues to grow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for that. And Claire, go ahead.
So I know that one of the investment area focuses of Clio Capital is the future of income, new marketplaces. I'm not sure if this is an out there question, but I was curious about the passion economy, which is something that I've been hearing a little bit more about, and was wondering, the passion economy, creator marketplaces. Are there any startups that you've looked at in that area? And I guess what your thoughts are on what immediately came to mind for me, which is just like with these more niche areas, these more niche marketplaces and startups, what your thoughts are on kind of scalability and which startups are going to be able to scale in that space.
And sorry, just to clarify, like you're talking about all like marketplaces in general, or?
Or I guess I'm talking about, I think it's Lee Jin who first termed like the phrase like passion economy and the idea.
Yeah, no, it wasn't Legion who first coined that. It was somebody else who wrote a book of it. But yeah, so passion economy as an area we focus on. But what is the question around the market size of the passion economy?
Or more about first, are there any startups that you've looked at in that space or invested in that space? And then also what your thoughts are on, I think with the passion economy, as I was curious, often it involves like making creator tools or things like that, but because it tends to focus on sometimes more niche areas, like a niche marketplace that's targeted towards a particular, passionate consumer, what your thoughts are on like kind of what to watch out for when it comes to scalability and whether or not a certain startup is the one that's right for venture capital and instead of focusing.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah. So we don't see the passion economy and more broadly kind of the 1099 economy. We don't see it as niche, right? Like most people at some point are going to, especially in the current environment, they're going to make money in a way that is like part-time or something else, and so we don't really see that as a small thing in terms of at all in terms of getting a specific company, whether or not a specific company would be more niche. The answer is like don't you can be narrow if you're deep, right? And you can be shallow if you're wide. You don't want to be like narrow and shallow, meaning that like if you say, hey, I'm building companies, I'm building like wedding dresses are a great example, right? Functionally, no one buys more than 3 wedding dresses in their life. And most people don't buy more than one, but it's a really expensive purchase, right? So if you were a wedding dress manufacturer, you're making, $1,500 to $5,000 every time somebody purchases, even though most people are only going to purchase from you once, that's a lot of money. If you made $1 every time somebody purchased and most people were only going to purchase from you once, you would not make a lot of money, right? And so, the way to think about it is if you have, how do you make $1 million, right? One person can give you $1 million, 1 million people can give you $1. And so the way that we think about market sizing, and this has nothing to do with passion economy, this is just for any company, is how do you make money at scale, right? Not some people pay Zoom, a lot of people don't pay Zoom, but a lot of people using Zoom and paying a little bit of money makes them a lot of money, right? And so thinking about, are you trying to build something with massive scale where a bunch of people pay you a little bit of money? Are you trying to build something small where a small number of people pay you a lot of money? And pay you can be advertising dollars or subscription or direct purchases, whatever. But that's the question that you're trying to answer. And there's not certainly a right or wrong answer to it, but it does need an answer, if that makes sense. And so, what how do you do it or how should you do it? I don't know, because it's the company that you would build that you are excited about, right? So if you are a wedding dress designer, you shouldn't try to go build, dollar store products and vice versa. So there's nothing wrong with either of those. It's just that they're different, right? So my general feedback would just be, if you're thinking about building something in a specific area, the question really just has to be, is this going to be something where one person gives me $1 million or where 1 million people give me $1? And the answer doesn't matter. But if the answer is, that 5 people are going to give me $1, then a $5 company is probably not going to work well. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. Thanks. Okay, it definitely changes my thoughts on the issue. On the fashion economy, that is. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much for that, both you, Sarah, and you, Claire. I think due to time constraints, we might have to make that our last questions. And so, Sarah, if you have any last pieces of advice, last words that you'd like to leave us with, I'm happy to hand things over to you to end things off with that.
Yeah. So I always give you guys the same kind of weird advice, because I'm probably the only one who does this, but I think that there's increasingly, like the newest Forbes 30 under 30 list just came out yesterday. And as somebody who's been on Forbes 30 under 30 and who's been a judge for Forbes 30 under 30 and who's been a Forbes 30 under 30 all-star, was just texting with my friend Whitney, who's on the cover of the 10-year anniversary issue of it after taking a company public. Like, my advice is kind of the opposite, which is like, you guys, I think, are often such like box checkers and on such a treadmill of like, how do I go start a company? How do I go do this? How, like, chill out. Like, you're 22, like, go. I don't know why any of you on your last day of classes are like sitting here listening to me instead of like burning down every bar in Boston, right? And so, not that you need to drink to have fun, but it sure doesn't hurt. But I think that there's sometimes you have so much time to figure out what you want to do. And look, if you stumble into that early and you start building something, I would say at this age, my general advice would be, it's totally fine to start a company, but I would start a company more because you are having so much fun doing something, and then it kind of turns into a company, versus this sort of like treadmill box checker. Where's my rubric? How do I get my company started? How do I get on Forbes 30 under 30? How do I start a VC fund? How do I like, who cares? You have, well, okay, there's two pieces of this. On one hand, you have the rest of your life. On the other hand, with global warming, the world could end tomorrow. But either way, there's no upside in like spending this time of your life just like mindlessly trying to achieve things, which is exactly how you all got into Harvard, right? You got into Harvard because you are amazing box checkers, and you got into Harvard because you're really good at achieving things and understanding the rubric. You're not the smartest people in the world. You are among the smartest people in the world, and you are the best box checkers out of the smartest people in the world, if that makes sense. So, you're always going to have this urge to just go like be on a treadmill. Treadmills suck. Go wander around outside for a while is my literal and figurative advice. So, it's great to learn this stuff now. And it's certainly a fun time to explore and build things because you want to. You don't have a lot of downside. But if you feel like, oh my God, I'm 22. And when Mark Zuckerberg was this age, he had, this many millions of users, like, do not go start a company, go to like therapy and work on that. Because the reason to do this is because you're passionate about something and you love it, not because everybody else from your high school who got into Harvard then went on and started a company.
Honestly, Sarah, that resonates pretty heavily with me. And
I know you're all going to be like, how does she know? Why is she in my brain? And none of you are going to listen to me, and that's totally fine. But that is my parting advice for you. Go have fun with your life.
Sounds amazing. And Sarah, it's been nothing but an honor hearing your advice. Thank you again so much for joining us. And yeah, on behalf of all of HUCP, we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much again, Sarah.
Yes. Bye.
Bye. Thank you guys so much for attending.
Yeah, of course. It's pretty